Backstairs Billy, maid staff, miserable, and the Queen Mother kept smiling before William Tallon became Backstairs Billy. He was just a boy with royal scrapbooks, a jeweler's eye for detail, and a hunger for a world that was never built for boys like him. That hunger is what makes his story dangerous. Billy did not begin as a villain in a palace corridor. He began as a child looking at royalty from the outside, studying the photographs, the uniforms, the smiles, the rooms, the horses, and the strange promise that some lives could be made to look effortless. He wanted nearness, not simply money, not simply status, but nearness to the rooms where ordinary people were expected to disappear. But palace dreams do not stay innocent for long. The darker rule Billy would learn is this: the person closest to comfort can become more dangerous than the person closest to power. He did not need a crown. He did not need a title. He did not sign papers or sit at the grand table. All he needed was access, memory, timing, and a royal woman who smiled every time he made the world easier for her. And once the Queen Mother smiled, almost everyone below stairs understood the warning. William John Stevenson Tallon was born in 1935 in Berkeley County, Durham, above his grandfather's hardware shop. It was a practical place to enter the world if one hoped to understand class. Upstairs, a baby. Downstairs, nails, screws, buckets, brooms, and the quiet arithmetic of keeping a family afloat. No footman waited near his cradle. No silver rattle came from a duchess. No grand drawing room hid ordinary life behind flowers. There was a shop, a family, and a Britain still carrying the habits of empire, while many of its citizens carried tiredness on their collars. That beginning mattered because Billy's life became a long argument with distance. He could see polish, order, and rank from far away, but he had not been born inside them. Some boys grow up wanting to own things. Billy grew up wanting to be near them, near the rooms, near the rituals, near the people whose names were printed as if history itself had made room for them. After his family moved to Coventry, Billy entered a different Britain, working, industrial, and far from the velvet society he adored. He trained with a jeweler in Leamington Spa, and that detail almost feels like foreshadowing. Jewelry taught him that shine is never accidental. You study small surfaces. You learn that one scratch can damage the whole impression. You learn that beauty often comes from labor that has been hidden. That was a useful education for royal service. No one around him could have known he would one day understand flowers, dogs, drinks, silver, and the politics of a royal pantry. But the instinct was already forming. Look closely, polish carefully, and never forget that appearance can hide the work beneath it. Billy's love for royalty was not casual. He collected press cuttings. He followed royal tours. He watched King George VI and Queen Elizabeth as if they belonged to a fairy tale that had somehow learned to travel by ship and aircraft. Those scrapbooks were not just childish admiration. They were a rehearsal. Every photograph taught him how grandeur behaved, how it dressed, how it smiled, and how it made millions of people accept distance as devotion. So he wrote letters to the royal household asking for work. Again and again he wrote with the nerve of someone who had decided embarrassment was cheaper than giving up. He was a schoolboy from Coventry asking for a place near the throne. The palace did not answer quickly, but Billy kept asking. That persistence is important because it tells us something about Billy before power ever reached him. He was not waiting for class to bless him. He was pushing toward it, politely, obsessively, and with the stubbornness of someone who had already decided that ordinary life was too small. The monarchy to him was not just employment. It was escape, proof, and belonging by proximity. If he could not be born into the world of rank, perhaps he could stand close enough to breathe its air. And once a boy begins to confuse nearness with belonging, every open door can look like destiny. When the reply came, it changed the shape of his life. A letter from the comptroller of the household brought a form, a travel warrant, and a chance to go to Buckingham Palace. One side of the door was ordinary work and ordinary wages. The other side was Windsor, Buckingham Palace, royal corridors, and the hidden machinery of monarchy. But Billy was not being invited to become royal. He was being invited to serve. That distinction would follow him for the rest of his life. He could stand close enough to hear royal voices lower, close enough to know which glass mattered, close enough to understand a mood before a secretary understood a problem. But the door he entered was still the servant's door. At 15, Billy joined the royal household as a junior assistant at Easter Court at Windsor. He did not enter a fairy tale. He entered a machine that taught young people how to vanish politely. The first lesson of royal service was not elegance. It was erasure. Do the work. Hide the effort. Swallow the insult. Make sure the person upstairs never has to know how much it cost. This was the real palace education. Not the staterooms, not the uniforms, not the public photographs, but the knowledge that grace is usually manufactured by people who are not allowed to look tired. A palace trains the eye to admire the polished table and ignore the hands that polished it. It trains the guest to notice the flower arrangement and not the person who carried it in before breakfast. Billy learned this system from the bottom, which meant he learned both its humiliation and its power. Later, when he climbed high enough to give orders, he would remember the power more clearly than the humiliation. To outsiders, royal service can look like a costume drama. To those inside, it is a military operation with better napkins. Bells rang, orders traveled, tea had to be tea, shoes had to appear, fires had to be laid, names had to be remembered. A guest who wanted hot water did not care that history might be unfolding in the next room. Small mistakes became large failures. A late tray was not just late, a glass was never just a glass. A badly placed chair could feel like a moral collapse. That is how palaces turn detail into discipline. Billy learned that rule early. Later, he would use it on everyone beneath him. At the center of the world Billy entered stood Queen Elizabeth, wife of King George VI. She had been born Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1900, and she had mastered high society long before the crown landed on her head. She had charm without appearing to push it too hard, which is often the most effective form of pushing. She could make a room feel warmer simply by entering it. She knew when to be gentle, when to be gracious, and when to become immovable behind a smile. The Queen Mother's charm was real, but charm at that level is never harmless. It softened rooms, disarmed critics, made guests feel chosen, and made staff work harder to keep the warmth alive. Her smile could look like kindness from above. From below, it could feel like a command no one had dared to speak. Her life had already been shaped by crisis. Her husband, George VI, had never expected to reign. Edward VIII abdicated in 1936, and the crown moved sideways onto Bertie, the shy Duke of York, who became king because his brother chose Wallis Simpson. Queen Elizabeth had watched her husband, a man with a stammer and private anxieties, pushed onto a public stage because another man refused the part. She helped him stand there. During the Second World War, when London was bombed and Buckingham Palace was hit, she became what successful royal women often become in crisis, a symbol so polished that the effort behind it almost disappeared. She visited bombed neighborhoods, wore the right expression, said the right words, and turned endurance into social art. By the time Billy entered service, she had steel beneath lace. That steel matters because the Queen Mother was not merely a sweet old royal lady who liked flowers and dogs. She was a woman who had watched the monarchy nearly break over abdication, then helped turn her husband's reluctant reign into a public image of steadiness. She understood that softness could be a weapon when used correctly. A smile could calm a crowd. A gracious word could make hierarchy feel kind. A warm room could make privilege seem almost maternal. Billy was drawn to this because it was exactly the kind of power he understood best. Not loud, not written on paper, but felt by everyone who entered the room. Then in 1952, King George VI died. His elder daughter became Queen Elizabeth II. His widow became Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. A title can sound like comfort and still feel like exile. She had lost the husband she had stood beside through abdication, war, illness, and public duty. She had lost the role that had defined her adult life. She was near the crown, but no longer at its center. Clarence House became her answer to that loss. It was more than a residence. It became a stage, a refuge, a salon, a social engine, and eventually a small kingdom with its own weather. It was also a defense against emptiness. Lunches, racing talk, flowers, dogs, old friends, drinks, letters, guests, and private rituals helped keep grief moving, dressed, and unable to sit too long in the room. But somebody had to arrange the sparkle. Somebody had to know which guest liked what, which dog was where, which chair was safe, and whether a particular clergyman could be trusted near a second drink. A royal room does not become graceful because royalty walks into it. It becomes graceful because someone has removed every sign of work before the royal person arrives. The Queen Mother's warmth looked natural because the labor behind it had been trained to disappear. That is where Billy found his place. Clarence House was not Buckingham Palace with its vast official coldness. It was a court in miniature. A person could matter there. A tone could matter. A favorite could rise. Billy saw in the Queen Mother the kind of royal life he adored. Old style, personal, ceremonial, intimate, full of ritual and laughter. The Queen Mother saw in Billy a servant with devotion, energy, memory, and a spark that could make a house feel alive. Their bond was not just employer and servant, it was an exchange of loneliness. The Queen Mother needed a world built around her so widowhood would not swallow the room. Billy needed a royal woman around whom he could build the life he had rehearsed since childhood. She gave him purpose. He gave her atmosphere. Everyone else paid for the arrangement. That does not mean the bond was fake. It may be more disturbing because it was real. The Queen Mother did need loyalty, warmth, and people who knew how to keep grief from settling too heavily around her. Billy did need purpose, recognition, and a royal center strong enough to justify the life he had built around service. Their needs fit together almost too well, but when two people need each other inside a hierarchy, the people underneath rarely get to vote on the price. Staff did not simply work for a household. They worked inside the emotional arrangement between a widowed royal woman and the man who made himself essential to her comfort. This is why the story cannot be reduced to one bully and one indulgent mistress. It is colder than that. Clarence House rewarded results. If the Queen Mother was comfortable, if guests were pleased, if the room glowed, then the method became easier to ignore. A harsh word downstairs disappeared behind laughter upstairs. A tired servant became invisible once the dinner succeeded. The house did not have to approve cruelty in theory. It only had to keep rewarding the person who made the royal illusion work. Billy learned the rhythm of her day: morning tea, papers, correspondence, engagements, guests, dogs, clothes, meals, racing news, visits, and the endless choreography of a woman who lived privately in public view. The Queen Mother liked warmth around her, not chaos, not vulgarity, not slackness, but warmth. Clarence House could laugh, it could hum, it could feel alive. Billy suited that world perfectly. He was funny, sharp, theatrical, ambitious, and deeply observant. He understood that in a palace, being liked was useful, but being needed was better. Being liked fed vanity. Being needed fed the soul. A man who wants applause can be managed. A man who needs to be necessary will defend his position like a throne. Billy's throne was not upstairs, it was the corridor. The other staff noticed him. People always notice the colleague who catches the eye of the boss. A laugh from the Queen Mother. A glance allowed too long. A correction Billy gave without being challenged. These were small signs, but in a royal house, small signs become weather. Everyone below stairs knew when the weather had changed. From that point, Billy's authority became atmospheric. It did not always need instructions. It could live in a pause, a look, a tone, or the knowledge that he understood the Queen Mother's preferences better than most people dared to challenge. That kind of authority is difficult to fight because it is never fully written down. If someone complained, Billy could appear merely exacting, merely devoted, merely protective of standards. The wound was often in the way he made people feel: smaller, slower, less worthy of the house he believed he alone truly understood. Billy's power did not arrive through one grand promotion. It gathered in small moments. A word from him carried more force. A junior servant watched his face before moving. A request from him sounded less like a request and more like a warning. He did not need an official speech to make his importance known. He carried it the way some men carry a watch chain. He did not merely serve, he interpreted. If the Queen Mother seemed tired, he adjusted the room. If she seemed bored, he found liveliness. If a guest needed flattering, he knew the tone. If a guest needed removing, he understood the art of making departure feel like destiny. He could produce comfort before discomfort had confessed itself. He could also produce fear below stairs before a mistake had fully happened. That was the double edge of his gift. He read the Queen Mother beautifully. He did not always read his colleagues kindly. For Billy, the Queen Mother became the center around which every room had to turn. If she needed the house to shine, everyone below stairs was expected to disappear into the work of making it shine. A tired housemaid, a resentful footman, a cook under pressure, a junior servant with hopes of a day off, all these were real people. But in Billy's imagination of service, they risked becoming supporting players in the great production of Her Majesty's happiness. It was a noble aim if one happened to be Her Majesty. For everyone else, nobility can start to feel like unpaid overtime wearing white gloves. The Queen Mother's life was not only emotional, it was expensive. She lived grandly because she believed her role required it, and because she enjoyed it. There were houses to maintain, staff to employ, guests to entertain, horses to support, charities to patronize, clothes to manage, traveled to arrange, and gifts to give. She came from a generation and class in which hospitality was a moral language. To receive people poorly was not economy, it was failure. But generosity upstairs required management downstairs. Bills had to be paid, accounts had to be handled, staff had to stretch themselves around expectation. A royal person could think in terms of gracious living. The office had to think in terms of figures. The household had to think in terms of labor. The Queen Mother's charm had bills. The flowers, horses, houses, staff, travel, gifts, dinners, and effortless hospitality did not float above money because everyone spoke beautifully. Somewhere, someone had to count the cost. That is the part royal nostalgia rarely photographs, the invoice behind the glow. Billy, being closest to daily comfort, usually sided with life rather than leisure. If the Queen Mother wanted the house full and lively, then full and lively it must be. The fact that someone else had to square the bills was regrettable, but not allowed to spoil the flowers. This was not mere extravagance. It was identity. After losing her husband, after stepping back from queenship, after watching the modern world press against the monarchy, the Queen Mother maintained herself through ceremony and hospitality. Still, the work fell somewhere. Billy made sure it fell correctly, which often meant heavily. This is where the staff become the hidden character of the story. They were not famous, but they were the human cost of the atmosphere. They carried the trays, polished the glass, dealt with the dogs, moved the luggage, answered the bell, repaired the small disasters, and absorbed the moods that could not be sent upstairs. Their names rarely travel as far as the royal names, but without them, the warmth would have collapsed. That is why Billy's reputation matters. He was not only one difficult man, he was the person through whom a whole system of invisible labor became sharper, louder, and harder to escape. By the late 1970s, staff misery under Billy was no longer a single incident waiting to be named. It was a pattern, a harsh word here, a humiliating correction there, an impossible demand made possible only by someone else's exhaustion, a sense that Billy's closeness to the Queen Mother placed him above normal challenge, an awareness that he could charm upstairs and bite downstairs. That pattern is what made the story darker than ordinary workplace conflict. If Billy had simply been bad-tempered, staff could have named the problem more easily. But his temper came wrapped in devotion. He could say he was protecting the Queen Mother's comfort, defending standards, preserving the house. In a palace, that kind of excuse carries weight. It turns pressure into loyalty and makes resistance look like disrespect. These grievances rarely make official history because nobody writes them on palace stationery. They live in memory, and memory waits. Billy would probably have said he served standards, not ego. He might have argued that Clarence House was not a holiday camp and that the Queen Mother deserved the best. He would not have been entirely wrong. That was what made the matter difficult. The best is often built by people who are not asked whether they wish to be heroic today. The Queen Mother depended on the house. The house increasingly depended on Billy. And Billy depended on being needed. That is a dangerous triangle because nobody in it can easily step back. The Queen Mother liked the comfort he provided. The staff had to live with the methods. Billy, having built his identity around devotion, could not become ordinary again. He had not spent his life climbing the backstairs merely to stand aside while others decided how the Queen Mother should be served. As the Queen Mother aged, Billy became more necessary and more feared. Age added needs without reducing expectation. More care, more planning, more caution, more attention to movement, rest, medicine, travel, weather, and fatigue. Yet she did not wish to be treated as fragile. That is one of old age's sharpest negotiations. The body asks for help while pride refuses to sign the receipt. Billy understood this negotiation better than most. He could help without making help feel like defeat. He could preserve the Queen Mother's dignity by anticipating what she needed before she had to ask. That was one of his finest gifts. He did not only manage comfort, he protected pride. This is why she kept trusting him. To her, Billy was not merely bossy below stairs. He was the man who knew how to let her remain herself. In old age, that is no small service. Friends die. Children grow old themselves. Public life changes. The body narrows one's choices. A person who can keep familiar pleasures, arriving in familiar ways, becomes precious. Billy gave her that. The staff saw another side. They saw the pressure of preserving another person's pride at all costs. They saw how Billy's closeness made him hard to resist. They saw how his standards became harsher as the Queen Mother's needs became more delicate. If the Queen Mother could not be allowed to feel diminished, then everyone around her had to work harder to conceal the diminishment. That is where tenderness and tyranny began to look dangerously similar. A chair placed correctly could be an act of love. A car arranged at the right angle could protect an old woman from embarrassment. A drink timed perfectly could preserve a rhythm that made age feel less victorious. But the same acts, when forced through fear, became burdens. Billy could be defending dignity and bruising dignity in the same hour, depending on which side of the corridor a person stood. Upstairs, he preserved the Queen Mother's selfhood. Downstairs, he sometimes treated other people's selfhood as part of the furniture. There is a thin line between preserving dignity and preserving denial. Billy walked that line every day. From upstairs, his work looked like devotion. Downstairs, it could feel like an entire household being ordered to pretend time had not entered the room. When Diana entered the royal family, the contrast between old and new emotional codes became harder to ignore. Diana brought youth, beauty, warmth, and visible pain. The Queen Mother belonged to a generation that believed pain should be dressed before it came downstairs. Diana belonged to a newer emotional world, one where hurt wanted air. At first, the difference looked like youth. Later, it looked like danger. Billy served the old heart of the family. His loyalty followed the Queen Mother's instincts: duty, privacy, steadiness, public face. Diana's public suffering threatened that world because it suggested that silence could be a prison, not a virtue. Billy did not need to hate Diana to distrust the disruption she represented. She brought sympathy from the public, but she also brought exposure. Exposure was the enemy of everything Clarence House had been built to preserve. The Queen Mother's answer was continuity. She kept going. She attended engagements, followed the racing, entertained friends, and maintained the tone of a woman who had seen worse and would not be hurried into vulgar panic. This steadiness impressed people, but steadiness required staff. It required Billy. Then came 1997. Diana died in Paris in the early hours of August 31st. The old royal rules tried to behave as if they still had authority, but the country had changed. Diana's death came through breaking news, television bulletins, photographs, speculation, and a public grief that moved faster than any palace could manage. The Queen Mother belonged to a generation that believed grief should be carried with dignity, preferably behind a door. Britain in 1997 wanted grief in the street. in flowers, in tears, in crowds outside palaces, demanding visible proof that Diana had mattered. It was not only sadness, it was accusation. Billy was trained for one world, not the other. He could arrange a room. He could soften an evening. He could protect the Queen Mother from fatigue and shock. He could keep staff moving and private rituals intact. But he could not manage a nation that had placed flowers by palace gates in mountains. He could not lower the temperature of television. He could not tell a crowd that mourning had a correct hour and a correct tray. Billy had spent his life controlling rooms. Diana's death created a grief no servant could polish away. For the first time, the atmosphere was not inside Clarence House. The atmosphere was the country itself. The more the world outside spun, the more Billy demanded that the world inside stand straight. This was the old royal reflex in miniature. When scandal, grief, or public anger threatened the family, the answer was not confession first. It was order first. Shoes polished, rooms ready, meals served, faces composed. Billy believed in that order because he had watched it give the Queen Mother shape through widowhood and age. But Diana's death exposed the limit of the old method. A room can be controlled, a nation cannot. A tray can arrive on time, public grief will not. By the late 1990s, the Queen Mother was extremely old. Each year required greater care. Her public appearances remained admired because she seemed almost indestructible. But no one at close range could pretend age was not making demands. She needed support, careful arrangements, precise timing, and protection from exhaustion. Yet she did not want to be packed away like a valuable vase. She wanted to live. She wanted racing, lunches, visits, Scotland, family, friends, and the old rhythm of life. Billy guarded that appetite with almost ferocious tenderness. If she wanted her house alive, he kept it alive. If she wanted the old rituals, he upheld them. If she wished to continue public duty, he helped make it possible. To him, reducing her life for convenience would have been betrayal. The staff, however, lived with the daily difficulty of that resistance. It is beautiful when an old woman refuses to surrender life. It is tiring when an entire household must organize the refusal before breakfast. The approach of her 100th birthday gave Clarence House a new purpose. In August 2000, the Queen Mother turned 100, a milestone that turned affection into celebration. Britain loves a centenary when it comes with flags, hats, and a woman who had lived from Queen Victoria's era into the reign of her own daughter. She had seen 2 world wars, the abdication, the end of empire, the rise of mass media, the collapse of deference, and the arrival of a public that expected royals to have feelings and perhaps discuss them at length. She had not discussed hers at length. That may have been part of the appeal. The centenary was a triumph of public affection. Crowds gathered, tributes poured in. The Queen Mother appeared on the balcony, smiling beside family, small in body but vast in symbolism. Billy would have understood the emotional power of the moment. Every small duty over decades had led, in some private sense, to this. The Queen Mother, still there, still smiling, still cherished. For the public, it looked like endurance. For Billy, it must have looked like vindication. The long days, the impossible standards, the rescued dinners, the corrected rooms, the carefully protected routines, all of them seemed to gather into that one national image. She had survived. The old world had not entirely vanished. The woman he served was still loved. And if she was still loved, then perhaps the life he had spent building around her had not been wasted. If he felt pride, he had earned some of it. But pride can be lonely when it has cost others too much. By this stage, stories about Billy were already part of royal service folklore. He was Backstairs Billy, affectionate in one mouth, bitter in another. To some, he was a devoted retainer, funny, loyal, irreplaceable, one of the last great palace characters. To others, he was remembered as a difficult, bullying, and sometimes cruel figure who made staff lives miserable and survived because the Queen Mother adored him. Both stories continued to live because both had witnesses. His longtime companion, Reginald Wilcock, was part of his private life inside the royal orbit. Reginald had been companion, colleague, and part of the world Billy built around the Queen Mother. In a more open age, their relationship might have been treated simply as long companionship. In the world that formed them, it had to move through discretion. That discretion protected them from some judgments and denied them ordinary recognition. When Reginald Wilcock died, Billy suffered a private blow that could not be separated from his professional world. To lose Reginald, while the Queen Mother herself was fading, meant the two pillars of Billy's existence were weakening at once. A man who had often seemed invincible in corridors was facing the ordinary human fact that love and status can both be mortal. Still, there was work. There was always work. The Queen Mother's final months drew the household into a tighter circle. She was very old, increasingly frail, yet still herself in flashes. Billy knew the distance between public legend and private body. He knew when the old sparkle appeared and when exhaustion followed. He knew what it meant when appetite faded, movement narrowed, and the day became smaller. For all his faults, there is something moving in that knowledge. To serve someone closely for decades is to become a keeper of their ordinary humanity, not the history book figure, not the beloved national symbol, the person, the woman who liked certain drinks, certain jokes, certain flowers, certain horses, certain rooms, certain people near her, and certain people preferably elsewhere. Billy knew that woman. He had loved serving her, perhaps even loved her in the complicated way a servant can love a royal person who gives his life meaning while never quite belonging to him. When the Queen Mother died on March 30th, 2002, the nation lost a beloved royal figure. The royal family lost its oldest matriarch. Britain lost one of its last living links to the wartime monarchy. Clarence House lost its center. Billy lost the source of his power, purpose, and protection. For nearly 50 years, every instruction, every sharp correction, every perfect tray, every rescued evening, every polished ritual had pointed toward her comfort. Without her, the machinery had no reason to run in the same way. The rooms could still stand, the furniture could still be cataloged, the silver could still shine. But the living force that made Billy powerful had gone. The staff who had endured him may have felt grief, relief, uncertainty, or all three in the same breath. That would be human. An era can end and still release people from pressure. A beloved royal can die and still leave behind employees who know that tomorrow no one can use her preference as a weapon quite so easily. Clarence House had been a place of warmth and strain, laughter and fear, loyalty and exhaustion. The Queen Mother's death did not simplify any of it. It simply made it history. And history is often kinder to the drawing room than to the corridor. The public remembered the hats, the pearls, the smile, the wartime courage, the old-fashioned sparkle, and the national grandmother who seemed to have outlived the century by force of charm. Staff remembered other things too. The late nights, the pressure, the sudden corrections, the knowledge that Billy's favor mattered more than fairness, and the way royal affection could make ordinary workplace cruelty almost impossible to challenge. A servant who has been feared inside a household can become strangely pitiful when the source of his authority disappears. Fear does not transfer automatically. It has to be backed by power. Billy's power had not come from an office title alone. It came from the Queen Mother's trust, affection, and need. When she died, his voice still sounded like Billy's voice, but the royal echo behind it faded. Then other memories began to move. Staff who had endured him could now speak with less caution. The stories that had lived below stairs for years hardened into reputation. Billy had been devoted, yes, but to some who worked around him, he was also remembered as difficult, bullying, dramatic, and sometimes cruel. He was remembered by critics as a man who made life miserable for people who had little protection against him. His defenders could say he kept standards alive. His critics could answer that standards should not require humiliation to stand upright. Both sides had evidence, and neither side could erase the other. That is the truth about household legends. They do not die cleanly. They split. One Billy served the Queen Mother with extraordinary loyalty. He preserved her dignity in old age, kept her houses alive, understood her loneliness, guarded her pleasures, and gave his adult life to making her days warmer. Another Billy was remembered by some staff as sharp, controlling and protected by royal favor, a man who treated the Queen Mother's comfort as permission to bruise everyone else and build a small empire from access. These men were not rivals. They were the same man seen from different rooms. After Billy's death, items connected to his royal service came into public view. Photographs, letters, gifts, keepsakes, and objects associated with the Queen Mother and her circle seemed to open a side door into the private monarchy. People wanted the smaller things, the personal things, the evidence that famous people had written notes, given thanks, chosen presents, and lived daily lives. In those objects, Billy's world became collectible. There was something both fitting and sad about that. He had spent his life arranging the private world of a royal woman. After his death, fragments of that world were arranged for sale and inspection. The intimacy he had guarded became value. The souvenirs of service became trophies for others. The saddest part was not simply that objects were sold. It was that intimacy became inventory. A life spent guarding private royal moments ended with those moments priced, cataloged, handled by strangers, and turned into proof that other people could purchase a piece of the nearness Billy had paid for with his life. Billy would have understood that appetite. He had felt it first as a boy, cutting out pictures and dreaming his way toward the palace. The buyers after his death wanted nearness to royalty through paper, silver, inscription, and story. Billy had wanted nearness too. The difference was that he had paid for it with his life. The Queen Mother understood the need to feel valued. Her own life, for all its privilege, had been shaped by role changes she did not choose. She became queen because of another man's abdication. She became widow when her husband died too young. She became queen mother when her daughter took the throne. Again and again, history renamed her. She survived by turning each role into a performance of purpose. Billy, in a smaller and more fragile way, did the same. He became what the Queen Mother needed, then mistook that need for permanent identity. Their bond was real because both were, in different ways, displaced people inside ceremony. She had lost the center of her life when George VI died. He found the center of his life when he joined her household. She needed a world built around her to keep loneliness at a distance. He needed someone worth building a world around. Together they made Clarence House glow. That glow is the reason the story still works. If Clarence House had been only cruel, there would be no mystery. If Billy had been only a monster, there would be no tragedy. If the Queen Mother had been only indulgent, there would be no complexity. The power of the story is that the glow was real. People did feel welcomed. The Queen Mother did give comfort. Billy did create atmosphere. Staff did perform work that mattered. The pain came from the fact that beauty and harm were not separate rooms. They were often built from the same order. But glow is not innocence. The Queen Mother could be generous and demanding, warm and insulated, charming and expensive. Billy could be loyal and bullying, funny and vicious, tender and vain. Their household could be beautiful and suffocating. The old royal system could produce devotion and cruelty from the same polished rule book. That is why the story remains interesting. Not because one person was a villain and another a saint, but because everyone involved lived inside a structure that rewarded the very behavior it later pretended to regret. Billy made staff miserable because misery was easy to hide downstairs. The Queen Mother kept smiling because Billy made sure the smile had everything it required. The staff kept working because that was the job, and because royal service had always depended on people swallowing more than they served. The public kept adoring because it saw the result, not the method. And the method mattered. A royal household is not just a backdrop. It is a machine that turns labor into grace. When it works well, guests feel welcome, the public feels reassured, and the royal person appears naturally elegant. But nothing about it is natural. Someone rises early, someone stays late, someone is corrected, someone cries in a corridor and returns with a tray. Someone remembers the exact preference that prevents royal irritation. Someone makes the impossible look traditional. Billy was one of the last masters of that machine and one of its warnings. He believed in service as art. He understood timing, beauty, comfort, and emotional protection. He knew how to keep an old woman's dignity alive when age tried to steal it. He knew how to make rooms feel warm and occasions feel effortless. He also confused perfection with permission. He believed that because the Queen Mother's happiness mattered, other people's unhappiness could be treated as a manageable expense. That is where devotion became dangerous. The Queen Mother's smile made the arrangement appear harmless. A smiling old lady, a funny servant, a house full of flowers, dogs, drinks, racing papers, and old friends. From a distance, it sounds like a charming lost world. Up close, it was also a workplace, and workplaces reveal character faster than drawing rooms do. The people downstairs saw Billy without the flattering lamps. They saw the pressure, the favoritism, the sudden turns of temper, the sharpness protected by royal affection. Their memories complete the picture the public never saw. In the end, neither the smile nor the misery cancels the other. The Queen Mother gave Britain a form of comfort across a violent century. She stood beside her husband during war and fear. She endured widowhood by making life bright around her. She charmed people who needed charm. She remained vivid almost to the end. Billy served her with rare devotion. He preserved her private world with skill, feeling, and almost frightening commitment. And he did make people suffer. The most honest portrait leaves all of that in the frame. Backstairs Billy was never just a nickname. It was a map. It showed where his power lived, behind the visible rooms, In the passages where real houses are run, it showed why he mattered and why he hurt people. It showed the path from a boy with royal scrapbooks to a man whose voice could make staff freeze. It showed how a servant could become essential to a queen mother and still remain, in the end, outside the door. The queen mother kept smiling to the public until almost the end because smiling was her duty, her talent, and her defense against loss. Billy kept that smile, supplied with everything a smile of that kind required: order, beauty, timing, loyalty, and other people's obedience. Together they created a world that looked gentle from the drawing room and felt much sharper in the corridor. That is the secret of many grand houses. The velvet is real. So are the bruises. And somewhere in the history of Clarence House, beyond the flowers and photographs, beyond balcony waves and funeral hymns, one can still imagine the old rhythm of the place. A bell, a footstep, a door opening softly. The Queen Mother waiting with her famous smile, Billy moving through the back stairs ready to protect it, and someone below stairs seeing him coming, straightening at once.